Hello, Free Speech and the Challenge of Social Media students. Dr. Conway here, back for lesson 10 on skills and tools for assessing information on social media. You will recall that we've gone through a couple of key lessons since the midterm break. Certainly one on the engineering of social media infrastructure, the other on the social psychological impacts of social media. And the spread of misinformation and disinformation was also a key lesson that we covered. On this one, we're shifting to some practical skills that you can develop to become, to avoid becoming an amplifier, to be recruited to be an amplifier of misinformation and disinformation circulation on social media. And that's social media training type skills. Now, some of these tools that I'm going to talk to you about today, the only way to look at them is to try them, to understand them is to try them yourself, right? To get on to the tools and take a look at what's involved and so on. But before we get to that, I want to cover off a few key skills that anybody can use to avoid becoming an amplifier of misinformation and disinformation on social media. Things that don't require tools, that just require common sense and a little bit of investigation on your own to avoid that situation. So let's take a look at these things. So how you can contribute to reducing misinformation and disinformation on social media. It's a very important topic because, we can sit back and we can complain about there being misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and so on. But the people spreading them on social media are people just like us, and it may be us if we're not careful, right? So if we want to be responsible social media users, we want to protect free speech from being discredited in the social media environment, then it's incumbent upon us all to be careful about what we circulate on social media, to make sure that it isn't contributing to misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, hate speech, and so on social media. And there's some basic things that we can do, right? So let's go today through skills to combat misinformation and disinformation, key points about fact checker sites to help us discern facts and falsehoods, and prominent internet tools for assessing facts and falsehoods. Like I say, the tools, you need to go through the slides and look at them and access the sites yourself and see what they provide to help you in determining whether you're, or to protect you from becoming basically an amplifier of misinformation and disinformation on social media. And if we're careless and we spread things anyway, then we can have as many courses as we want, like the one we're doing now. We can talk about free speech as much as we want, but if we become a source of the problem of free speech and social media, then we have to look at ourselves in the mirror, right? So let's talk about these topics. Let's look at basic skills to combat misinformation and disinformation. As we go through. So in other words, to be part of the solution rather than the problem, social media users must be willing to practice common sense skills to ensure that reason is not suspended and that emotion is tamed, so that we don't become tricked, we don't become fools into being an amplifier of misinformation and disinformation on social media. So before information is shared on social media platforms, users should complete a basic fact check on the story, all right? Don't just read the headings and then advance it because the headings are extremist and it gives you any emotional gratification right away just to circulate it. That's what we're trying to avoid, right, in social media use. We know that social media infrastructure is geared to allow you to move things through social media very easily, through one click, for example, right? So we need to guard against that. So before you do that, it's some common sense things. If you read something that you suspect is outrageous on social media or seems unlikely, then take the time. It often doesn't take very long to do to make sure you don't become a part of the problem. Instead, you become a part of the solution, okay? Make sure that an article or anything you read is not intended to be satire, to be sure. all right, which can sometimes be hard to tell in social media. So you need to investigate. Sometimes satire can be used for very positive things. A lot of the times, if something doesn't, it sounds outrageous, it may very well be, and it's incumbent upon you to do some checking, all right, before you circulate it. So start by searching other credible sources to see if they are reporting facts that confirm the story, at least substantially, right? If a story sounds outrageous, okay, it would normally be front page news in credible newspapers, right? Like the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, New York Times. Before you circulate anything outrageous, check those newspapers, right? Is it there? If it's not there, it's probably because these newspapers have already investigated it and found it to be a falsehood, right? An effort at disinformation, if not misinformation, right? So it's very important to and that takes what? That takes a few, less than a minute to determine whether this is a real story or not. If it's not a real story, don't recirculate it. That's part of the problem, okay, that we're trying to get at. So investigate the details of the article, such as the date, to make sure it is not rehashed information deceptively used out of context, right? And we talked about this, right? The tendency to cherry pick facts, to take stories out of context, and so on in our previous lecture on misinformation and disinformation. Secondly, always consider the source of the story, right? Check the author's profile on social media to determine whether a bias is revealed. If somebody is presented as an expert, let's say on climate change or on women's issues or violence against women or violence against indigenous peoples or whatever, and says something outrageous, trying to be an apologist for it or something like that, but they present themselves as an expert, it doesn't take long, right, to Google that person's name and find out what's really going on. Usually you can find, Facebook posts that are outrageous or any other types of social media presence that would indicate this person's not a real expert. They're selling themselves as an expert, but really they have a completely different agenda. All right. And be sure that the source is not trying to hijack the profile of credible sources via forged domain name. Forged domain names are very common in this game of spreading disinformation and misinformation, right? For instance, the domain name of CBC News is what it is, right? www.cbc.ca/news, right? But a false site might be cbccanada.info, trying to pretend they're CBC when they're not CBC. This happens all the time. So you check the URL and make sure that the URL is credible, right? You don't, I see, and what happens, you end up circulating a CBC article that has never been a CBC article, and it's full of falsehoods, right? It is also important to be skeptical of facts that might instead be nothing more than opinion, right? Nothing more than opinion. To have no substantiation in the story. Sometimes you can put those facts into Google line and just say, is it true that, and put the proposed factual statement. Usually you'll come back and one of the fact-checking sites has already posted it as being nothing but bunk. All right? So be careful with that kind of thing. And these things I'm telling you right now, all of them can take not even a minute to do, sometimes seconds to do, right? To be able to make sure that you're not becoming fooled, being duped into becoming an amplifier of falsehoods and untruths on social media, okay? False experts can also be used to appear to lend credence to claims in the story, and as such, checking the credentials of experts is very, very important. I do that all the time. Particularly when I'm dealing with things like climate change or things like human rights or violence against minority groups or whatever, all topics I'm very interested in. Like when people say that, it seems this is incredible. There's no way, I will type in the expert's name and I'll quickly find out, okay, all right. This person, has basically been, involved with ExxonMobil or some other oil company or is a right-wing advocacy group or a right-wing think tank or whatever. And I'm not saying that automatically rules them out for being factual and truthful, but it gives me suspicion to at least not circulate it until I find out more, right? It's very, very important to do that. And all of these things, like I say, take hardly any time, right? Google's very quick now, right? Just copy it from the article, put it into Google, click, who is Dr. Jameson Peters? Boom, right? I mean, you can find out right there what, the person, has a LinkedIn page or has a Facebook page or has a Twitter account or whatever. It's, all that will come up, and it's very quick. You can check the veracity of that individual's expertise. There are certain approaches used in credible journalism to legitimately protect anonymous sources, right? So we often hear that in journalism, don't we, right? Journalists will report things, and maybe in marginal journalist papers, marginal print media, they'll say, credible sources said that, all right? I'm always very suspicious when somebody says credible sources said that, but they're not prepared to be revealed in public. Granted, there are very good reasons sometimes why they can't be revealed in public, for legal reasons or reasons of physical violence or threats of physical violence and those kind of things. So that doesn't immediately disqualify. But I'm going to want to check a little bit, right? A little bit more as to whether there's anybody else reporting the same types of stories, all right? And are these sources credible before I circulate anything on social media, before I post it to my LinkedIn page, before whatever I do, okay? I'm going to make sure, because it's far too easy, right, for weak journalism to basically point to sources that will not reveal themselves. Well, okay. And so whenever I see a situation like that and it's more and more outrageous, I become more and more suspicious about those sources. And I'm not going to circulate that on social media if I find that it's, I'm doubtful and the sources have remained anonymous. Usually I park that and I'll look at whether there's any substantiation for that. That includes using it in research papers or commentaries or anything like that. I'll do the same thing. I won't just automatically accept the journalist's word for it when there's whistleblower sources that refuse to be identified. Right? It's far too easy to push misinformation and disinformation through journalism as well. It's done all the time. Journalists have to guard against that all the time, right? Where people, sort of, hey, wink, wink, nod, nod, I've got something to tell you, right? And they try to feed you basically a nonsensical, untruthful story. Right? Journalists have to guard against this constantly. It happens to them all the time. So they become skilled, but maybe not adequately skilled. They also come under pressure to push articles out before anybody else pushes it out, right? And so sometimes they have a tendency to be a little bit lax on guarding themselves against anonymous sources. All right, so to avoid becoming a problem, are duped into becoming an amplifier of that, then, take some precaution. Take some precaution and investigate a little bit if you think it's serious. If all you're doing is being flippant and circulating things around social media, well, you risk of becoming a major source of the problem, right? So claims of anonymous sources or identities are not revealed because the person did not have permission to speak publicly. Whenever I see that, I'm going to wait. I'm going to pause. I'm going to think about it a little bit. Is this credible? Is anybody else reporting anything similar in the New York Times or the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, or has the government released a announcement on this, or has a credible research institute been talking about this already? And that can usually be, one Google line, right? Is it true that? And see what comes up, okay? I mean, basic things where all it takes is a little bit of effort not to become a part of the problem for misinformation and disinformation circulation on social media, and to protect the credibility of free speech so that social media doesn't have to be regulated. I mean, we can take a lot of power into our own hands, all right? Thirdly, be sensitive to your own emotional response when you read something. This is the game that spreaders of disinformation and misinformation try to recruit you, right? They try to play to your emotions, right? They try to get you to knee-jerk react to a clickbait heading or something like that, to recirculate it to all your friends on Facebook or on LinkedIn or on Twitter or whatever, right? because they hooked you, right? They hooked you with an emotional line that in fact turns out later on to be completely untrue. But when we talked about the social psychology of social media, you can see how emotion basically suppresses reason, right? And if they and that anger and anxiety emotion tends to be gratified first in the human brain for human survival instinct. There was a reason for that. It's genetically programmed, and we discussed about this. So calm yourself and say, look, is this credible? I mean, is this credible? Before I circulate this to my friends and treat them as fools as well, or dupes as well, let's take a look at this first before I do that, all right? Or, send out to your friends. But if you send it out to your friends, then I don't know about this. What do you think, guys? Or what do you think, folks? Do you think this is credible? Does anybody have anything? Send it out that way. That's fine, okay? But don't send it out as automatically assumption of truthfulness, because you haven't verified that it's truthful or not. You're just reacting totally on motion, not on reason, not on logic, okay? So if you find yourself getting emotional, right? I was right, or I'll get them, or oh, they're nasty people. If I feel feelings like that when I'm looking at something on social media, my first reaction is to say, okay, wait a second here. Let me take a look at this before I do anything with it, because I'm suspicious, and I think this is playing on my emotions, because they have algorithms, they have cookies, they know what I like to look at, they know. So just hang on a minute, okay? Let's take a look at this before I start to spread it. Something nasty said about Indigenous people and their harvesting rights, or something like that. Some people will grab that emotion. Oh, they get special privileges, or I mean, this is emotion. This is not. Investigate the facts first, okay, before you circulate these things. All right. Don't become a part of the problem. Become a part of the solution. It doesn't mean you're not entitled to your free speech on social media, but what it means is if you're going to be a responsible citizen on social media, when you exercise your free speech, it must be based at least on some facts and truthfulness. Otherwise, you become part of the problem and not part of the solution. All right, so keep those basic tips in mind. Now, key points about fact checker sites. There are all kinds of fact checker sites out there now that can also help you to understand whether something is truthful or not, right? Particularly if you're doing research, for example, for a research paper or something like that. These fact checker sites can be quite valuable, right? And become not a duped amplifier of misinformation and disinformation. They can be very valuable. And they've emerged in social media, lots of them, right? And the best sites are out there, but the best sites for our purposes are those that are widely judged by independent sources to be unbiased across the political spectrum. And you can find fact checker sites that are generally unbiased. And I have them in this presentation later on, all right? They are kept up to date and continually improving their fact checking approaches and methodologies. In other words, there are credible sites, right? But like all misinformation and disinformation tactics on social media, of course, those people that try to propagate misinformation and disinformation also set up their fact checker sites, and they try to pretend they're as credible, which is the characteristic of social media, right? They try to mirror credible sources with discreditable sources, all right? But students should be aware that there are many fact-checking sites that can be used to debunk lies, all right? They have their uses, very important uses, for when you're doing research or you're wondering whether something is truthful. Students should research fact-checking sites to ensure that they maintain strictly nonpartisan methods. All right? So if you check a fact-checker site, make sure. And in other words, fact-check the fact-checker site. Just Google it. Give a review of such and such fact-checker site. And there are experts out there, academics and others, that review these things on an ongoing basis. And they'll tell you if it's a biased site or not a biased site, right? And you can do some basic research on that. All right? And so it's important to look at these kinds of fact checker sites and understand the value that they can play if you're doing research, or you're interested in a topic, or you're trying to deal with you believe in environmental protection or human rights protection or whatever, and you're reading a lot on these things. Be very wary, because these are the highly political areas where people will target disinformation and misinformation. And so learning about these fact checker sites can be a very valuable asset, right? And so I'm not going to get into these. The slides are pretty obvious on all of these things, right? So, go through these slides and look at the different ways these fact checker sites can be verified, all right? And so, and understand what all the different tactics that can be used, right? And that you have to guard against, right? So I'll let you go through now. At the third part of this slide is I give you some of the sites, all right? So, and these, the best way to do is click on the URL and just check out the sites yourself, so you understand what's there and what's possible, all right? The Common Sense Education, PolitiFacts is another one, Snoops, Facts Can, Facts Can, what it does, and Fact Check. There's a whole bunch of Hoaxslayer. Google Reverse Image can be used to check images. TinEye is another one. Photo Forensics. There are lots of different sites out there, all right, that can help you not only with the veracity of a text, but also help you with assessing, whether a photograph has been doctored, right? Or whether something whether a video has been doctored. There are various techniques and various ways that various tools you can use. And I encourage you as part of your studying, just go through some of these sites and at least be aware of them and try some of them out. I mean, just try them out and see how easy it can be to help you determine, truth and factualness from misinformation and disinformation. All right. So on that, these are technical issues that are not well handled on a social media context, unless you're willing to become, to have practice at clicking on them, or put them up on your favorites on top of your screen or whatever, so you can click on them quickly and access them. But if you're serious about not being a part of the problem in social media, then getting some familiarity with these tools is very, very important skill going forward. All right. So do practice them. And take a look at them and find some outrageous stories and put them in, or find a picture and run a test. Play with them a little bit to develop your skills on these things. It's easy to be lazy in social media, and that's a major part of the problem of misinformation and disinformation spreading in social media, right? It's a lot easier just to click and send forward than it is to take a few minutes to calm your emotions, think reasonably, do some of the basic research I was talking about early in this presentation, and where necessary, use some of these fact checking and these video checking sites to determine whether something is credible or not, before you go down the road of becoming a part of the problem and becoming an amplifier of misinformation and disinformation. On that score, gang, I'll let you go, and we'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye now.